She held his mother like she was made of porcelain, but her eyes held 40 years of secrets that could shatter everything Vincent Sterling thought he knew about love. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tonight's story will shatter your heart and rebuild it completely. Tonight, a billionaire discovers his mother crying in the maid's arms, then learns a secret that changes everything he thought he knew about love. Let's begin. Vincent Sterling's Bugatti purred to a stop outside the Georgian mansion that had housed 5 generations of Sterling wealth. At 38, he commanded a tech empire worth $12 billion, yet returning to Whitmore Estate always made him feel like the awkward child who'd never quite pleased his demanding mother. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and old money as he strode up the limestone steps, his Italian leather shoes clicking against stone worn smooth by decades of Sterling footsteps. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across Persian rugs that cost more than most people's houses. This was his world, one of privilege, expectations, and emotional distance measured in stock portfolios and social standings. Mother. His voice echoed through the marble foyer. At 73, Eleanor Sterling remained formidable despite her recent health scares. The heart attacks had started 6 months ago, each one a reminder that even Sterling money couldn't buy immortality. Silence greeted him. Vincent loosened his Hermes tie, irritation creeping up his spine. He'd flown in from Tokyo specifically for her doctor's appointment, rearranging meetings worth millions. The least she could do was... A sound stopped him cold, soft weeping, coming from the morning room. He moved toward it, his business instincts sharpening. Eleanor Sterling didn't cry. In his entire life, he'd seen her shed tears exactly twice at his father's funeral, and when their prize Arabian had to be put down. Emotion was weakness in the Sterling household, a luxury they couldn't afford when appearances mattered more than feelings. The weeping grew louder as he approached the partially open door. But there was something else, a gentle voice, warm and melodic, speaking in soothing tones he'd never heard directed at his mother. Now Miss Eleanor, you're safe. I'm here. Vincent frowned. He recognized that voice. Rosalind Washington had worked for his family for 40 years, arriving as a young woman of 25 when he was barely 8. She'd been a constant presence throughout his childhood, making his beds, preparing his meals, cleaning up after his boarding school friends during holidays. Reliable, quiet, invisible in the way good help was supposed to be. But this voice wasn't the deferential tone he remembered. This was intimate, familiar, almost loving. He pushed the door open another inch and froze. Meanwhile, in the morning room, Rosalind Washington had learned long ago that heartbreak was a luxury she couldn't afford. At 65, her hands bore the testimony of 4 decades spent caring for a family that paid her well but saw her as furniture, necessary, dependable but ultimately replaceable. Except for Eleanor. My chest, Eleanor whispered against Rosalind's shoulder, her perfectly coiffed silver hair now disheveled, her carefully applied makeup streaked with tears. It hurts so much, Rosie. Not just the heart, everything. All these years of pretending. Rosalind's arms tightened around the woman who had been her employer, her friend, and her secret love for longer than most marriages lasted. In this room, with its butter-yellow walls and morning light streaming through lace curtains, they could pretend the outside world didn't exist. Here, Eleanor wasn't the Sterling matriarch and Rosalind wasn't the help. They were just 2 women who had found something precious in each other, despite every rule society had written against it. I know, honey, Rosalind murmured, using the endearment she'd whispered in stolen moments for decades. I know it hurts, but we've made it this far, haven't we? 40 years of stolen glances and secret smiles. That's more than most people get in a lifetime. Eleanor pulled back slightly, her blue eyes, still sharp despite her age, meeting Rosalind's brown ones. Is it enough, all this hiding? This pretending you're just staff. You've given me everything, and I've given you nothing but secrets and shame. You've given me love, Rosalind said firmly, her thumb brushing away a tear from Eleanor's cheek. Real love. The kind that chooses to stay, even when it's hard, even when it's hidden. That's not nothing, Eleanor. That's everything. The morning light caught the gold band on Rosalind's right hand. A simple ring Eleanor had given her 20 years ago during a moment of courage that had lasted all of 10 minutes before fear took over again. It was the closest they'd ever come to making their relationship real. "But I'm dying," Eleanor whispered, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence. "These heart attacks, the doctor's face yesterday. I can feel it, Rosie. I'm running out of time, and Vincent will never understand. He'll never accept us. What happens to you when I'm gone?" Rosalind had wondered the same thing countless times. Without Eleanor's protection, without the excuse of employment, what was she? Just another aging black woman with no family of her own, no husband, no children, because she'd chosen love over convention, secrecy over safety. "We'll figure it out," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We always do." Eleanor was about to respond when a shadow fell across the doorway. They both looked up to see Vincent Sterling standing there, his tall frame filling the entrance, his expression unreadable. The morning light that had felt so warm moments before suddenly seemed harsh and exposing. Rosalind's arms instinctively loosened around Eleanor, 40 years of training reasserting itself. She was the help. He was the heir. This was not her place. But Eleanor's grip on her hand tightened, a silent plea not to let go. "Not yet." "Vincent," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. "You're early. What would you do if you discovered a family secret that challenged everything you thought you knew about love? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones society tells us aren't supposed to exist." Vincent's jaw tightened as he processed the scene before him. His mother, the woman who had raised him to believe emotions were weaknesses and appearances were everything, cradled in the arms of their housekeeper like what? What exactly was he looking at? "Mother, what's wrong? Are you having another episode?" He stepped into the room, his business instincts taking over. "Should I call Dr. Morrison?" But his eyes kept drifting to Rosalind, to the way she held Eleanor with such practiced tenderness, to the tears in her own eyes that she was trying to hide. In all his years, he'd never really looked at Rosalind Washington. She'd been background noise, part of the estate's machinery. But now, seeing her hold his mother with such obvious care and grief, he realized he'd never actually seen her at all. "No doctors," Eleanor said quickly, sitting up straighter but not moving away from Rosalind's protective presence. "I'm fine, Vincent. Just tired." "Tired?" His voice rose slightly. "Mother, I found you crying in..." He gestured helplessly between them, unable to put words to what he'd witnessed. "What's going on here?" The silence stretched between them, 40 years of secrets hanging in the air like dust motes in the morning light. Eleanor looked at Rosalind, then at her son, and Vincent saw something in his mother's eyes he'd never seen before. Fear. Not of dying, but of living. Of finally telling the truth. "Vincent," Eleanor said slowly, "there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." And in that moment, with the morning light streaming through lace curtains and the scent of his mother's jasmine perfume mixing with the lemon polish Rosalind used on the furniture, Vincent Sterling's carefully ordered world began to crumble. The words hung in the morning air, like a held breath. Vincent felt his world tilt, the same sensation he'd experienced during his first skydive, the moment when solid ground disappeared and nothing was certain anymore. "What could you possibly need to tell me that involves..." He gestured again at the intimate tableau before him, his voice strained. "Mother, you're scaring me." Eleanor's hand found Rosalind's, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of lovers who had touched in secret for decades. The simple gesture hit Vincent like a physical blow. His mother, the woman who had taught him that public displays of affection were vulgar, who had criticized every girlfriend he'd brought home for being too emotional, too needy, too human, was holding hands with their housekeeper. "Vincent, sit down," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority that had run Sterling Industries before his father's death, that had shaped him into the man he'd become. But underneath that authority, he heard something else. Vulnerability, fear, love. He remained standing, his body rigid with confusion and a dawning awareness that whatever his mother was about to say would change everything. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed too bright, too revealing. He wanted to close the curtains, to return to the comfortable shadows of ignorance. 43 years ago, Eleanor began, her voice steady but her hands trembling. I married your father because it was expected of me. Because Sterling Industries needed the merger with my family's shipping company. Because that's what people like us did. We married for business, for appearances, for everything except love. Vincent's throat constricted. He'd always known his parents' marriage had been arranged. But hearing it stated so baldly, so clinically, made him feel sick. Mother. Let me finish. Eleanor's grip on Rosalind's hand tightened. Your father was a good man, Vincent. He provided for us, he built the company into what it is today. But he was cold, distant. He saw marriage as a contract, nothing more. And I tried to be the wife he needed, the perfect Sterling matriarch. For 28 years I tried. Rosalind shifted beside her, and Vincent noticed how her free hand rested protectively on Eleanor's shoulder. The gesture was so natural, so unconsciously loving, that it spoke of thousands of similar moments. Moments he'd never seen because he'd never bothered to look. But you were lonely, he said quietly, the pieces beginning to form a picture he didn't want to see. Eleanor's laugh was bitter. Lonely doesn't begin to describe it. I was disappearing, Vincent, becoming this automaton who went through the motions of living without ever actually being alive. And then, her eyes met Rosalind's, and the love there was so naked, so pure, that Vincent had to look away. And then Rosalind came to work for us. Eleanor continued. She was 25, recently moved up from Alabama. She needed work, we needed help, and I thought she'd be like all the others. Invisible, safe. But I wasn't invisible to you, Rosalind spoke for the first time since Vincent had entered the room, her voice soft but clear. Was I, Eleanor? No. Eleanor's voice broke on the word. God help me, you weren't invisible at all. Vincent felt the room spinning around him. The implications of what his mother was saying crashed over him in waves. You're telling me that you and Rosalind, that you've been… He couldn't finish the sentence. Lovers, Eleanor said simply, and the word fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would never stop spreading. For 35 years, Vincent. Since 5 years after she came to work for us, since the night your father forgot our anniversary again, and I found myself crying in the kitchen at 2 a.m., and Rosalind came downstairs to make sure I was all right. The memory seemed to transport Eleanor back to that night, her voice growing softer, more intimate. She didn't say anything at first, just made me tea and sat with me. But when I started to cry again, really cry, she put her arms around me and Eleanor's voice caught. And for the first time in my adult life, someone held me like I mattered. Not like I was Mrs. Sterling, not like I was a business asset or a social accessory, like I was just Eleanor. A woman who was hurting and needed comfort. Vincent sank into the nearest chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. The leather wingback that had been his father's favorite seemed to mock him now, a symbol of the cold, transactional world he'd inherited and perpetuated. One night became 2, then 3. Eleanor continued, lost in the memory. We'd meet in the kitchen after your father went to bed, just to talk about books, about dreams we'd given up, about the lives we might have lived if we'd been braver. And somewhere in those midnight conversations, I fell in love. With a woman, Vincent said, his voice hollow. With Rosalind, Eleanor corrected firmly. Not with a woman, not with the help, not with some abstract concept. With this brilliant, kind, funny woman who saw me, really saw me, and loved me anyway. Rosalind's thumb traced circles over Eleanor's knuckles, a gesture so tender and automatic that it spoke of decades of small comforts given and received. Your mother saved my life, Mr. Vincent, she said, looking directly at him for the first time. I came here broken. I'd lost my fiancé in Vietnam, lost my family when they found out he was white. I had nothing and no one. But Eleanor, she gave me a home, a purpose, A reason to keep living. And I gave you lies, Eleanor said, bitterly. 35 years of hiding, of pretending you were nothing more than staff. 35 years of stolen moments and secret touches and love that had to hide in shadows. Vincent's mind reeled, processing decades of memories through this new lens. All those times he'd found his mother in better spirits after talking with Rosalind. The way Rosalind somehow always knew exactly what Eleanor needed. The little gifts that appeared in Rosalind's quarters, expensive perfume, silk scarves that he'd assumed were cast-offs from his mother's closet. The night your father died, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you know what my first thought was? Vincent shook his head, afraid to hear the answer. Freedom. Not grief, not loss. Freedom. And I hated myself for it. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face now, years of suppressed guilt and shame pouring out. What kind of wife feels relief when her husband dies? What kind of mother keeps such secrets from her son? The kind who was never allowed to live her own life, Rosalind said fiercely, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. The kind who sacrificed everything for duty and appearances and other people's expectations. Vincent looked at this woman, this stranger who wore Rosalind's face but spoke with a passion and protectiveness he'd never heard from her before. How had he never seen this? How had he lived in the same house with two women who loved each other this deeply and remained completely oblivious? After the funeral, Eleanor continued. I thought maybe finally we could be open. That maybe I could find the courage to live honestly. But then I looked at you, Vincent, at how you'd built your life around the sterling name and reputation, and I knew I couldn't. I couldn't risk destroying everything you'd worked for. So you kept hiding, Vincent said, understanding beginning to dawn. We kept hiding, Rosalind corrected. Both of us. Because we were cowards. Because 35 years of secrecy becomes a prison you can't escape even when the door is finally unlocked. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent stared at his hands, at the Patek Philippe watch that had been his father's, at the Sterling family crest on his signet ring. Symbols of a legacy built on appearances and expectations, on the very foundations that had kept his mother from living authentically for most of her life. When he finally looked up, he saw two elderly women holding hands in the morning light, their faces etched with years of hidden sorrow and stolen joy. And for the first time in his 38 years, Vincent Sterling began to understand what love actually looked like. Vincent stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The noise seemed to break the spell of intimacy that had filled the morning room, and suddenly the space felt too small, too suffocating, too real. I need some air, he said, his voice strained and unfamiliar to his own ears. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out, leaving his mother and Rosalind sitting in the wreckage of his carefully constructed reality. The hallway felt endless as he strode through it, past portraits of Sterling ancestors, who stared down at him with painted eyes that seemed to judge and condemn. Had they known? Had any of them suspected that the perfect Sterling matriarch was living a lie that made a mockery of everything their family supposedly stood for? He burst through the front doors and onto the circular driveway, gulping the crisp October air like a drowning man. His Bugatti gleamed in the afternoon sun, a symbol of success and achievement that suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. He'd built his entire identity around being a Sterling, around upholding the family legacy, and now he discovered that legacy was built on shame and secrets. Behind him, he heard the soft click of the front door closing. He didn't turn around, but he knew Rosalind had followed him. He could sense her presence the way you sense a storm approaching, not threatening exactly, but undeniably powerful. Mr. Vincent, she said quietly, her voice carrying the same deferential tone he remembered from childhood, the same voice that had told him dinner was ready, that his laundry was folded, that his mother was asking for him. How had he never heard the love underneath it when she spoke about Eleanor? Don't, he said sharply, still facing away from her. Don't call me that. Not now, not after. He ran his hands through his hair, destroying the perfect styling that had cost him $200 that morning in Tokyo. How long have you been laughing at me? Rosalind. How long have you and my mother been playing this charade while I walked around like an idiot, thinking I knew my own family? We never laughed at you, Rosalind said, her voice steady but sad. Never once, Vincent. You have to believe that. He whirled around to face her, and the sight of her standing there, this woman who had essentially raised him alongside his mother, who had been part of his daily life for 30 years, made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. Then what would you call it? 35 years of lies, of pretending to be something you're not? Survival, Rosalind said simply. We called it survival. The word hit him like a slap. Survival. As if loving his mother was some kind of threat to be endured rather than a gift to be celebrated. As if their relationship was something dangerous that required hiding rather than something beautiful that deserved recognition. From what? He demanded. What exactly were you surviving from? We gave you a good job, a comfortable life, health insurance, a retirement fund. What more could you possibly want? The moment the words left his mouth, he knew how they sounded. How callous and privileged and utterly blind he appeared. Rosalind's face didn't change, but something in her eyes dimmed, and he realized he'd just proved every fear his mother had harbored about his reaction. Respect, Rosalind said quietly. Recognition. The right to love who I love without hiding in shadows. The chance to be seen as more than just the help by someone I helped raise from a boy into a man. Vincent felt heat rise in his cheeks. That's not. I don't think of you as just. Yes, you do, Rosalind interrupted, her voice still gentle but now carrying steel. And that's not entirely your fault, Vincent. We taught you to see me that way. Your mother and I, we made a choice 35 years ago to prioritize your comfort, your inheritance, your future over our own happiness. We decided that keeping you in ignorance was kinder than forcing you to confront the reality of who we really are. And now, he asked, his voice cracking slightly. Now you've decided I can handle it? Rosalind looked back toward the house, where Eleanor waited in the morning room surrounded by decades of memories and regrets. Now your mother is dying, and she can't bear the thought of leaving this world without you knowing the truth about the woman she loves. The woman who has loved her through heart attacks and board meetings and lonely Christmases when you were too busy building your empire to come home. The accusation hung between them like a physical presence. Vincent wanted to deny it, to list all the times he'd visited, all the birthday gifts and holiday calls and dutiful son obligations he'd fulfilled. But the truth was, he'd been going through the motions for years, checking boxes on his filial responsibility checklist, without ever really seeing his mother as a person with her own needs and desires. She seemed fine, he said weakly. She never acted like she needed anything more than what she had. Because she learned not to, Rosalind said. Because 50 years of marriage to your father taught her that emotional needs were weaknesses to be hidden, not gifts to be shared. Because she spent so many years being the perfect sterling wife that she forgot how to be anything else. Vincent slumped against his car, the perfect paint job cool against his back through his expensive shirt. So, what am I supposed to do with this information? What am I supposed to feel? Congratulations, Mother, on your secret gay relationship with the woman who raised me. Sorry I never noticed you were living a lie for my entire adult life. You're supposed to stop making this about you, Rosalind said, and her words cut through his self-pity like a knife. This isn't about your comfort or your confusion or your precious family reputation. This is about two women who found love in impossible circumstances and have been brave enough to hold on to it for 35 years, despite everything the world told them about why they shouldn't. Brave? Vincent laughed, but it came out bitter and harsh. Brave would have been telling the truth. Brave would have been living authentically, instead of maintaining some elaborate deception. Rosalind stepped closer, and for the first time in his memory, she looked at him not as an employee looking at her employer's son, but as an equal, addressing an equal. You think it was easy? You think hiding our love was the coward's way out? Do you have any idea what it was like in 1989 for a white woman and a black woman to love each other? Do you understand what we would have faced if we'd gone public? Vincent opened his mouth to respond, but Rosalind wasn't finished. Your mother would have lost everything. Her social standing, her position in the company, probably even custody rights to you. I would have been fired without references, blacklisted from working in any decent household in the state. We would have been pariahs, Vincent. Outcasts. And for what? So we could hold hands at the country club and face the whispers and stares and hatred. The force of her words, the raw pain and frustration they carried, made Vincent take a step back. He'd never heard Rosalind speak with such passion, such unfiltered emotion. It was like seeing a completely different person, and he realized that was exactly what he was doing, seeing the real Rosalind Washington for the first time in his life. But things are different now, he said, grasping for solid ground in this conversation that kept shifting beneath his feet. It's 2024. People are more accepting. You could have what? Rosalind's laugh was sharp with decades of suppressed bitterness. Could have come out when you were in high school and watched you get bullied for having two mothers, one of whom was the black housekeeper. Could have announced our relationship when you were building your company and risked the scandal affecting your investors. Could have gone public when you started dating socialites and made you choose between your mother's happiness and your girlfriend's comfort with the family dynamics. Each possibility she laid out hit Vincent like a physical blow because he could see the truth in them. At 18, he would have been mortified. At 25, he would have worried about the business implications. At 30, he would have been concerned about how it would affect his dating life. At every stage of his adult development, he would have found reasons why their timing was inconvenient, why their love was disruptive to his plans. We waited, Rosalind said more softly, for you to become the kind of man who could handle the truth with grace and love instead of judgment and selfishness. The kind of man who could see past race and class and social expectations to recognize real love when it's standing right in front of him. And now? Vincent asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What kind of man am I now? Rosalind studied his face for a long moment, and he felt like she was seeing through all his defenses, all his carefully constructed personas, down to the core of who he really was. What she saw there, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. I guess we're about to find out, she said finally. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Vincent alone with his expensive car and his shattered assumptions about everything he'd thought he knew about love, family, and what it meant to be brave. Have you ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you saw them? Sometimes the people closest to us carry stories we never imagined. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Vincent sat in his car for 20 minutes, staring at the house that had shaped his childhood, but now felt like foreign territory. The engine was off, but his hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and uncertain. His phone buzzed incessantly. Emails from Tokyo, calls from his assistant, texts about meetings that seemed absurdly trivial now. How could he possibly care about quarterly projections and merger discussions when his entire understanding of family had just been rewritten? He was reaching for his keys, ready to flee back to the predictable world of boardrooms and profit margins, when he saw Dr. Morrison's Mercedes pulling into the circular drive. Eleanor's cardiologist. The appointment Vincent had flown across the world to attend. Guilt crashed over him like a cold wave. Whatever turmoil he was experiencing, his mother was still dying. Her heart was failing, and instead of being there for her during what might be her final medical consultation, he'd stormed out like a petulant teenager, because reality had proven too uncomfortable for his liking. Dr. Morrison stepped out of his car, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, who had been treating the Sterling family for over a decade. He nodded politely at Vincent, then headed toward the front door with the measured pace of someone bearing news that could be either hope or heartbreak. Vincent forced himself out of the Bugatti and followed, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. Inside, he found Dr. Morrison already seated in the living room with Eleanor and Rosalind. The sight of them sitting together, not hiding their connection now that the truth was out, struck him anew. Eleanor's hand rested on Rosalind's knee with casual intimacy, while Rosalind's thumb traced comforting circles on Eleanor's wrist. They looked like what they were, a couple facing a crisis together. The kind of partnership Vincent had seen in movies but never experienced himself, never even believed really existed. "Ah, Vincent," Dr. Morrison said, standing to shake his hand. "I'm glad you're here. Your mother will need your support for what we're about to discuss." Eleanor's eyes met Vincent's across the room, and he saw no anger there despite his earlier outburst. Only love, worry, and a question. Would he stay? Would he be the son she needed him to be? Or would he run again? Vincent sat down heavily in his father's old chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "What's the prognosis, doctor?" Dr. Morrison consulted his tablet, his expression grave. "I'll be direct, because that's what your mother prefers. The latest tests show significant deterioration. The medication isn't working as effectively as we'd hoped, and her heart function has declined to approximately 25%. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Vincent felt the blood drain from his face. "What does that mean, exactly?" "It means we're looking at weeks, not months," Dr. Morrison said gently. "Maybe 6 to 8 weeks if we're fortunate. I'm recommending we transition to comfort care and focus on quality of life rather than aggressive treatment." Vincent's vision blurred. 6 to 8 weeks. His mother, difficult, demanding, but undeniably the strongest person he'd ever known, had weeks to live. And he'd just wasted precious time arguing with her about choices she'd made decades before he was mature enough to understand them. "There is one option," Dr. Morrison continued, "though I have to stress it's extremely risky. There's an experimental procedure being trialed at Johns Hopkins, a form of artificial heart support that might buy us more time. But the surgery itself has a 40% mortality rate, and even if successful, recovery would be lengthy and painful." "What kind of time are we talking about?" Rosalind asked, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "If the surgery works, how much longer? Perhaps 6 months? Maybe a year?" "But the quality of life," Dr. Morrison shook his head. "She'd be bedridden for months, possibly permanently. The person you know might not survive the trauma, even if her body does." Eleanor had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she spoke. "I need time to think, to discuss this with my family." Her eyes moved between Vincent and Rosalind, and for the first time Vincent understood that by family she didn't just mean him. Dr. Morrison nodded. "Of course, but don't take too long. If you decide to pursue the surgery, we need to act within the next few days while you're still strong enough." After the doctor left, silence settled over the living room like snow. Vincent stared at his hands, processing the reality that his mother might die on an operating table in Baltimore, or slowly fade away in this house surrounded by 40 years of hidden love and unspoken truths. "I'm not having the surgery," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice calm and resolved. Vincent's head snapped up. "Mother, you can't just—" "I can and I will," Eleanor interrupted. "I've spent 73 years letting other people's expectations dictate my choices. I'm not spending my final weeks in a hospital bed, pumped full of drugs, unable to recognize the people I love. But if there's a chance," Vincent began. "A chance at what?" Eleanor's voice rose slightly. 6 months of misery? 6 months of being a medical experiment while the woman I love watches me disappear piece by piece. What kind of life is that, Vincent? Rosalind had been silent, but now she stood and walked to the window, her shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion. Eleanor watched her go, and the love and concern on her face was so naked, so profound, that Vincent felt like an intruder in his own family home. "Rosie," Eleanor said softly, "talk to me." "What am I supposed to say?" Rosalind's voice was thick with tears. "That I'm selfish enough to want you to risk everything for a few more months. That I'm noble enough to let you go without fighting. I don't know what the right answer is, Eleanor. I just know that either way, I lose you." The raw pain in Rosalind's voice broke something open in Vincent's chest. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't about family secrets or social expectations. This was about two people who had found something rare and precious together, and now had to watch it slip away. Eleanor stood carefully and walked to Rosalind, placing her hands on the other woman's shoulders. "You're not losing me," she said firmly. "Death doesn't erase love, Rosie. It never has. Look how many years we've carried this feeling, despite everything trying to stop us. But I'll be alone, Rosalind whispered, and the vulnerability in those words hit Vincent like a physical blow. For the first time in 40 years, I'll be truly alone, and nobody will understand what I've lost because nobody knows what we had. Vincent watched his mother pull Rosalind into her arms, watched two women comfort each other with the practiced tenderness of decades together, and realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just love, but the kind of love that endures impossibility. The kind that makes people brave enough to hide for 35 years, and finally brave enough to stop hiding when time runs out. You won't be alone, he heard himself saying, surprising everyone, including himself. Both women turned to look at him, and he saw hope and skepticism warring in their faces. I mean, if you want, you don't have to be alone. It wasn't eloquent, wasn't the grand gesture a moment like this probably deserved, but it was honest, and it was a beginning. Vincent, Eleanor said carefully, what are you saying? He stood up, his expensive suit wrinkled now from sitting in cars and slumping in chairs while his world rearranged itself around him. I'm saying that maybe it's time I learned what family actually means. What love actually looks like when it's real instead of whatever I've been doing with my life. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and fear. Vincent had spent 38 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that emotional distance was strength, that vulnerability was weakness. But looking at his mother and Rosalind, two women who had risked everything for love and were now facing its potential end, with more grace and courage than he'd ever shown in his entire privileged life, he realized that all his walls had really done was make him smaller. The surgery, he said finally. What if we bring the doctors here? What if we turn this house into whatever medical facility you need, but you get to stay home? With Rosalind, with your family. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Vincent, that would cost. I don't care what it costs, he said, and realized he meant it completely. Money is the one thing I have plenty of. Let me use it for something that actually matters for once. Have you ever had a moment where you realized your definition of family was too narrow? Sometimes the people we love most are the ones we've been blind to all along. What moments opened your eyes? Share below. For the first time since Dr. Morrison's arrival, hope flickered in Eleanor's eyes. Not hope for a cure. They all understood the reality of her condition, but hope for something more precious. Hope for time. Hope for dignity. Hope for love to be acknowledged and honored instead of hidden and ashamed. Are you sure? Rosalind asked, and Vincent realized she was speaking to both of them. This isn't a small thing you're offering, Vincent. This is acceptance. This is saying that what we have is worth protecting. Vincent looked at these two women who had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. One had given him life and opportunity, and every material advantage imaginable. The other had given him care and stability, and a model of quiet strength he'd never bothered to recognize. Both had given him love, even when he'd been too blind and selfish to see it. It's worth protecting, he said simply. You're both worth protecting. And for the first time in 40 years, Rosalind Washington smiled at Vincent Sterling like he was family. 3 days later, Vincent found himself doing something he hadn't done since childhood, sitting in the kitchen while Rosalind prepared dinner. The massive space that had once intimidated him with its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops now felt warm and intimate, filled with the sounds of gentle chopping and the aroma of Eleanor's favorite rosemary chicken. The medical equipment had arrived that morning. A hospital bed for the master suite, oxygen tanks, monitors, and enough pharmaceutical supplies to run a small clinic. Vincent had written checks without blinking, but watching the technicians transform his mother's bedroom into a medical facility had made the reality of her condition impossible to ignore. Eleanor was resting upstairs, her energy depleted by the morning's activity. The simple act of supervising the bed installation had left her breathless and pale, a stark reminder of how quickly her condition was deteriorating. She always loved this kitchen, Rosalind said softly, not looking up from the vegetables she was dicing with practiced precision. Even when she had no reason to be here, she'd find excuses, said it was the heart of the house. Vincent watched her work, noting the way her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had prepared thousands of meals in this space. "I never knew that," he admitted. "I always assumed she avoided the kitchen because it was, staff territory." Rosalind's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Your mother never saw anywhere as staff territory. That was your father's thinking. He had very clear ideas about proper boundaries and social hierarchies." The mention of his father created a familiar tension in Vincent's shoulders. Charles Sterling had been a force of nature, brilliant in business, demanding in life, and utterly convinced of his own moral authority. Growing up in his shadow had been both a privilege and a prison. "He didn't know, did he?" Vincent asked. "About you and Mother." Rosalind's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "No. Charles was many things, but observant about emotional subtleties wasn't one of them. As long as his dinner was on time and his shirts were pressed, as long as Eleanor played her role at social functions, he never looked deeper. But you were careful." "We were terrified," Rosalind corrected, her voice heavy with memory, especially in the early years. "Do you remember 1991, when that scandal broke about the senator's wife and her personal trainer? The media circus, the way she was completely destroyed socially." Vincent had a vague recollection of tabloid headlines and whispered conversations among his parents' friends. He'd been 13, more concerned with video games than political scandals. "Your mother watched that woman get eviscerated for having an affair with someone deemed inappropriate," Rosalind continued. "And that was just about class difference. We were dealing with race and gender on top of everything else. We knew what would happen if anyone found out." She scraped the vegetables into a pan, the sizzle of oil filling the temporary silence. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. "There was a close call once, 1995, I think. You were home from prep school for Christmas break, and your parents were hosting that big party for the hospital charity board. Do you remember?" Vincent nodded. He remembered being annoyed at having to wear a tuxedo and make small talk with his parents' friends instead of playing the new PlayStation he'd gotten for Christmas. Eleanor had been sick with the flu, running a fever but refusing to cancel because the party was too important. I was helping her get dressed, trying to get her fever down, and Rosalind's voice caught. "She was so weak and I was so worried about her." Without thinking, I kissed her forehead. Just a gentle kiss, the way you'd comfort anyone you loved who was suffering. Vincent felt his stomach drop as he realized where this story was going. Mrs. Pemberton walked in looking for the powder room. Rosalind continued. "She saw me kiss your mother's forehead, saw the way I was holding her, and the look on her face. I thought our lives were over." Margaret Pemberton had been one of his mother's closest friends, a pillar of their social circle, and someone whose opinion carried tremendous weight among the city's elite families. "What happened?" "Your mother, even sick as she was, immediately went into damage control mode. Told Mrs. Pemberton that I was checking her temperature, that I'd been taking care of her like a daughter would because I was worried about her fever. She played up the maternal angle, said I'd been with the family so long I'd become like family, that I sometimes forgot my place because I cared so much." The story painted a vivid picture of the tightrope they'd walked for decades, how quickly love had to transform into performance, how genuine care had to be reframed as professional dedication. "Mrs. Pemberton bought it?" "She wanted to buy it," Rosalind said, beginning to set the table with china that Vincent recognized from countless formal dinners. It was easier than considering the alternative. "But she watched us differently after that. We had to be even more careful." Vincent tried to imagine living with that level of scrutiny and fear, where a moment of tenderness could destroy 2 lives. How did you stand it? All those years of pretending. Rosalind was quiet for a long time, arranging silverware with the precision she brought to everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Because the alternative was losing her completely. And having Eleanor's love in secret was better than not having it at all. She looked up at Vincent, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You can't understand what it's like to love someone you're not supposed to love. To have something so beautiful and pure that the world tells you it's wrong, it's shameful, it's impossible. She walked to the kitchen island and opened a drawer Vincent had never paid attention to before. From it, she pulled a small wooden box, worn smooth by decades of handling. "Your mother gave me this on our 10th anniversary," she said, opening it to reveal a collection of photographs, letters, and small mementos. "We couldn't have wedding rings or public celebrations, but we marked the important moments in our own way." Vincent moved closer as Rosalind spread the contents across the marble counter. There were dozens of photographs he'd never seen. Eleanor and Rosalind at various ages, sometimes alone, sometimes with him as a child. In each image, their connection was obvious to anyone who cared to look. The way they stood just slightly too close, the way their eyes found each other even when looking at the camera, the genuine joy on both their faces. "This was taken the day you graduated from Harvard Business School," Rosalind said, pointing to a photo that showed the three of them on campus. Vincent remembered the day, his pride at his accomplishment, his parents' satisfaction at the sterling name being added to another prestigious alumni list. But in the photograph, he could see something he'd missed at the time: Eleanor and Rosalind sharing a private moment of pride and love while he posed obliviously between them. "You were both there for all of it," he said, the realization hitting him with unexpected force. "Every graduation, every achievement, every milestone. You were celebrating together, and I never knew." "We celebrated you together," Rosalind corrected. "You were the bridge between us, Vincent. In some ways, raising you gave us a way to be a family, even when we couldn't acknowledge what we were." She pulled out a letter, the paper yellowed with age and worn soft from repeated handling. "Your mother wrote me this after your father's funeral. It's the closest we ever came to making it real." Vincent looked at the envelope, addressed simply to R in his mother's elegant handwriting. He didn't ask to read it. Some intimacies were too sacred to share, but he could see from Rosalind's expression how much the words inside had meant to her. "She wanted to be brave then," Rosalind said, carefully folding the letter back into its envelope. "After Charles died, she talked about maybe finding a way to be open about us. But then she looked at you, at how you were handling the loss and the responsibility of taking over more of the business, and she couldn't bear the thought of adding more chaos to your life. So she chose my comfort over her happiness," Vincent said, guilt settling heavy in his chest. "She chose your well-being over everything," Rosalind corrected. "That's what mothers do, Vincent, even when it costs them everything they want for themselves." The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their conversation. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but with determination. She was wearing a simple blue dress that Vincent recognized as one of her favorites, though it hung more loosely on her frame than it once had. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, though her eyes had already found the photographs spread across the counter. "I thought I smelled dinner." "Just showing Vincent some old memories," Rosalind said, beginning to gather the photos back into their box, but Eleanor stopped her with a gentle touch. "Leave them," she said softly. "It's time he saw all of it. The good memories, not just the complicated ones." She moved to stand beside Vincent, and he caught the faint scent of jasmine perfume mixed with the clinical smell of medication. When she pointed to one of the photographs, a candid shot of the three of them during a Christmas morning when he was about 12, her hand trembled slightly. "You were so excited about that bicycle," Eleanor said, smiling at the memory. "You'd been asking for months, and we'd managed to keep it a secret somehow." In the photo, young Vincent was grinning beside a red mountain bike, but what struck him now was the adults in the background. His mother and Rosalind stood close enough that their shoulders touched, both watching him with expressions of pure love and satisfaction. They looked like what they were: two women who had conspired together to make a child happy, who had shared the secret joy of successful gift-giving. "We were a family," Vincent said, the words carrying a weight of recognition and regret. "We were always a family. I just never saw it." Eleanor's hand found her fingers cold, but her grip surprisingly strong. "You see it now," she said simply. "That's what matters." As the three of them stood in the kitchen surrounded by decades of hidden memories, Vincent began to understand something fundamental about love. It doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or public declarations. Sometimes the deepest love exists in the quiet moments, in the daily acts of care and protection, in the choice to stay even when staying requires sacrifice. His mother and Rosalind had been loving each other, and loving him in the only way their circumstances allowed. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to love them back with the same courage and commitment they'd shown for 35 years. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that Vincent had never experienced in his adult life. One built around presence rather than productivity, around being rather than achieving. He'd cancelled his entire schedule, delegating responsibilities to his senior staff with instructions not to contact him unless the company was literally burning down. For the first time since his Harvard graduation, Vincent Sterling wasn't the most important person in his own life. He woke each morning to the sound of Rosalind moving quietly through the house, preparing Eleanor's medications and breakfast with the same meticulous care she'd shown for 4 decades. But now he joined her in the kitchen, learning to make the specific herbal tea that helped Eleanor's nausea, mastering the exact temperature of toast that didn't aggravate her diminished appetite. "A little more honey," Rosalind instructed as Vincent prepared Eleanor's morning tea. "She's always had a sweet tooth, even when she pretended otherwise." "Mother has a sweet tooth?" Vincent asked, genuinely surprised. In his memory, Eleanor Sterling was the picture of refined restraint, measured portions, proper nutrition, nothing so indulgent as a genuine craving. Rosalind's laugh was warm and knowing. "Oh, honey, your mother could put away half a chocolate cake if she thought nobody was watching. Why do you think I always made extra dessert for dinner parties? Half of it disappeared before the guests arrived." The image of his composed, dignified mother sneaking cake in the kitchen felt both impossible and perfectly right. How many other small truths had he missed by never bothering to look beyond the surface? "What else don't I know?" he asked, settling onto a stool beside the kitchen island. Over the past weeks, this spot had become his favorite place in the house. Close enough to help, far enough away to give Eleanor and Rosalind their space when they needed it. Rosalind considered the question while arranging Eleanor's breakfast on a silver tray. Another thing Vincent had learned. His mother ate better when food was presented beautifully, when love was expressed through small acts of care and attention. "She talks in her sleep," Rosalind said with a soft smile. "Has for 30 years. Usually about you when you were little, or about the garden, or about places she wants to travel but never has. Last night, she was planning a trip to Morocco." "Morocco?" "She's always wanted to see the Atlas Mountains. Says she dreams about the colors there. All those oranges and reds and golds. She has travel books hidden in her closet. Pages marked with places she's wanted to visit since before your father died." Vincent felt a familiar pang of guilt. He'd traveled the world for business, seen 5 continents, stayed in the finest hotels and eaten at restaurants most people only read about. But he'd never thought to ask his mother if she wanted to go anywhere, never considered that her world might feel small despite its luxury. "We could take her," he said impulsively. "Charter a plane, bring medical equipment, make it work somehow." Rosalind's expression grew gentle but sad. "Vincent, she can barely make it up the stairs now. Yesterday she needed to rest halfway through her shower." The reality check stung, but Vincent was beginning to understand that love sometimes meant accepting limitations instead of trying to fix everything with money and determination. "But she'd like knowing she could," Rosalind continued. "She'd like talking about it, planning what she'd want to see. Sometimes the dreaming is enough." They carried Eleanor's breakfast upstairs together, a routine that had developed naturally over the past weeks. Eleanor was awake, propped against pillows in the hospital bed that now dominated the master suite, but she was looking out the windows at the gardens she'd tended for 50 years. "The roses need pruning," she said as they entered. "And the oak tree by the pond, that dead branch needs to come down before it falls." "I'll call the landscaping service," Vincent offered, but Eleanor shook her head. "Not the service. They don't know the garden like we do. Rosie, remember how we planted those roses? The year Vincent graduated from prep school. We must have spent 6 hours debating where each bush should go." Rosalind set the breakfast tray across Eleanor's lap and settled into the chair beside the bed, a chair that Vincent had moved from the sitting room, Because it was Rosalind's favorite, the one where she'd spent countless evenings reading, while Eleanor worked on correspondence or watched television. You insisted on planting them yourself, Rosalind said, brushing a strand of grey hair from Eleanor's forehead with casual intimacy. Even though your back was killing you, and I told you we should hire someone. But then they wouldn't be ours, Eleanor replied, catching Rosalind's hand and pressing it to her cheek. Anyone can pay for beauty, but creating it together, that's what makes it meaningful. Vincent watched this exchange from the doorway, struck by how natural they were together now that they didn't have to hide. These small gestures of affection, a touch, a shared look, the way they moved around each other with practiced grace, painted a picture of a partnership deeper than anything he'd ever witnessed. I'll help with the garden, he said, surprising himself as much as them. I mean, I don't know anything about roses, but I could learn. Eleanor's face lit up with genuine joy. Really? You'd want to do that? The truth was, Vincent had never shown the slightest interest in gardening. He'd dismissed it as one of his mother's hobbies, something to occupy her time between social obligations. But now, seeing how much it meant to her, understanding that every flower represented a memory shared with Rosalind, he realized the garden was much more than landscaping. It was a love story written in soil and seasons. I'd like that, he said honestly. Maybe Rosalind could teach me what you taught her. Over the following days, the three of them fell into an easy intimacy that felt both brand new and ancient. Vincent learned that his mother was funnier than he'd ever known, that she did devastating impressions of their old neighbors and had opinions about everything from celebrity scandals to international politics that she'd never shared in his presence before. He discovered that Rosalind was extraordinarily well-read, that she'd been taking correspondence courses for decades and could discuss literature and history with the same passion she brought to cooking and caregiving. She'd written poetry, too, verses about love and longing that Eleanor had saved in the wooden box alongside their photographs. Read the one about the garden, Eleanor urged one evening as they sat together in the master suite, the October light fading to gold outside the windows. Rosalind blushed like a teenager. Eleanor, I don't think... Please, Vincent said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. I'd really like to hear it. Rosalind retrieved the poem from the wooden box, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. When she began to read, her voice was soft but clear. In the language of roses, we speak our love, each bloom a secret word whispered, between earth and sky. Your hands guide mine to the root, teaching me that beauty grows. Only with patience, with faith. In seasons we cannot control. In this garden we are not mistress and servant, but two women learning that love, like flowers, blooms best in spaces where it feels safe to grow. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Vincent felt tears prick his eyes. When had he last cried? When had he last felt moved by anything more meaningful than a profitable quarterly report? That's beautiful, he said finally, his voice rough. Really beautiful. Eleanor squeezed Rosalind's hand. She has dozens of them. Love letters written in verse, hidden in that box for 30 years. Why hidden? Vincent asked. Poetry isn't, there's nothing wrong with writing poetry. Rosalind and Eleanor exchanged a look that spoke of shared understanding built over decades. Because poetry is truth, Rosalind said simply, and we weren't allowed to tell the truth about what we felt, who we were, what our life together really meant. So I wrote it down instead, kept it safe until maybe someday. Until now, Vincent said, understanding. Until now, when we can finally say everything out loud. That evening, as Eleanor dozed in her bed and Rosalind knitted in her chair, another thing Vincent had never noticed she did. He found himself talking about things he'd never discussed with anyone. His loneliness despite his success, his fear that he'd built a life that looked impressive from the outside, but felt empty inside, his growing realization that he'd confused achievement with fulfillment for most of his adult life. I've been thinking about the women I've dated, he admitted, his voice quiet in the lamplit room. And I don't think I ever really loved any of them. Not the way you two love each other. I don't think I even knew what that looked like until now. Rosalind's knitting needles paused. What did it look like to you before? Vincent considered the question. Transaction, I guess. Compatibility. Shared interests and social connections. Someone who fit into my life without requiring me to change anything fundamental about myself. That's not love, Eleanor said softly from her bed, her eyes still closed but clearly listening. That's convenience. Real love requires you to grow, Rosalind added gently. It asks you to become more than you were before, to stretch yourself in ways that feel uncomfortable but necessary. It's not supposed to be easy, Vincent. It's supposed to be transformative. He thought about the women he'd brought home over the years, elegant, accomplished women who had impressed his parents and fit seamlessly into sterling social circles. He'd never asked any of them to challenge him, never wanted them to see his flaws or call him on his mistakes. He'd wanted admiration, not authenticity. I want that, he said suddenly, the words surprising him. I want what you have. I want to love someone enough to be scared of losing them, to change for them, to choose them over everything else that seems important. Eleanor's eyes opened, bright with tears. Then you will, she said with the certainty of someone who had learned that love, real love, finds a way. When you're ready to be that vulnerable, that brave, love will find you. What does real love look like to you? Is it the fairy tale romance, or is it something deeper? The quiet courage to grow and change for someone else. Share your thoughts below about the difference between convenience and true connection. As the night deepened around them, Vincent realized something profound was happening. For the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the people who mattered most, not because of what they could do for him, or how they made him look to the outside world, but because they had taught him what family actually meant. Love wasn't something you possessed or achieved. It was something you practiced daily and imperfectly, with your whole heart. And finally, at 38 years old, Vincent Sterling was ready to learn. What does real love look like in your life? Is it the grand gestures or the quiet daily acts of care and understanding? If you're enjoying Eleanor and Rosalind's story, consider subscribing for more content about authentic relationships and the courage it takes to live honestly. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Vincent was in the garden with Rosalind, learning to deadhead the late-season roses. Eleanor watched from her wheelchair on the terrace, wrapped in cashmere against the October chill, offering gentle corrections and encouragement as Vincent fumbled with the pruning shears. Not so close to the stem, she called out, her voice weaker than it had been even a week ago, but still carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft. Leave room for new growth. Vincent's phone rang, just as he was beginning to understand the rhythm of the task. The meditative quality that Eleanor and Rosalind found in this work. The way caring for something beautiful could quiet the chaos of a busy mind. He almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed his assistant's number with the emergency-only designation he'd established. This better be the building burning down, Jessica, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation. Jessica's voice was tight with tension. Someone leaked information about your mother's situation to the press. The estate is surrounded by reporters, and they're asking questions about Mrs. Sterling's relationship with Rosalind Washington. The pruning shears slipped from Vincent's suddenly numb fingers, clattering onto the brick path. Across the garden, Rosalind looked up from the rosebush she'd been tending, her face immediately alert to danger with the instincts of someone who had spent decades watching for threats. What kind of questions? Vincent asked, though he already knew the answer would shatter the peaceful world they'd built over the past few weeks. They're calling it a exposé. Sterling family's shocking secret is the headline being shopped around. They have photographs, old ones, but clear enough. Pictures of Mrs. Sterling and Miss Washington that, well, sir, they don't look like employer and employee. Vincent's vision blurred. The photos from the wooden box, the decades of stolen moments that Eleanor and Rosalind had treasured in private. Somehow the press had gotten hold of them, or photos like them. Images that would destroy in a single news cycle what had taken 35 years to build. How? He managed to ask. We think it was Mrs. Pemberton's estate sale last month. She passed away, and her family was going through her belongings. Apparently, she kept documentation of various society families. Her son found a file labeled Sterling with photographs and what appear to be private investigator reports dating back to the 1990s. Margaret Pemberton, the woman who had walked in on that intimate moment in 1995, who had accepted Eleanor's explanation about family-like caring, but had clearly never stopped watching, never stopped collecting evidence. Even in death, she had found a way to complete the destruction she'd started decades ago. The story goes live in 6 hours, Jessica continued. I've reached out to our media contacts, but without a denial or explanation from the family, there's not much we can do to stop it. Vincent looked across the garden to where Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, her face pale but alert as she watched him pace with the phone pressed to his ear. Behind her, Rosalind had moved closer, one protective hand on Eleanor's shoulder, the other shading her eyes as she scanned the perimeter of the estate. Sir? Jessica's voice seemed to come from very far away. What would you like me to tell them? What did you tell the world when the truth was both beautiful and impossible to explain? How did you make people understand that love sometimes required hiding, that courage sometimes looked like cowardice, that the most authentic life could be built on necessary deceptions? I'll call you back, Vincent said, ending the call before Jessica could respond. He walked slowly back to the terrace, each step feeling like he was approaching an executioner's block. Eleanor's eyes tracked his movement, reading his expression with the accuracy of someone who had spent 73 years interpreting other people's moods and reactions. How bad? She asked simply. Bad, Vincent admitted, sinking into the chair beside her wheelchair. Pemberton kept files, photos, reports. Her family found them and sold them to the press. The story breaks in 6 hours. The silence that followed was deafening. Vincent watched all the color drain from his mother's face, watched Rosalind's hand tighten protectively on Eleanor's shoulder, watched 35 years of carefully constructed privacy crumble in real time. What kind of photos? Rosalind asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I don't know exactly, but Jessica said they don't look like employer and employee. Eleanor's laugh was bitter and broken. Of course they don't. We were never very good at pretending in private moments. That was always our weakness. We loved each other too much to hide it completely. So what do we do? Vincent asked, looking between these two women who had become his world, who had taught him what family actually meant just in time to watch it all be destroyed by a society that still couldn't accept love in forms it didn't recognize. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, staring out at the roses they had been tending together, at the garden that represented decades of shared dreams and secret joy. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but resolute. We deny it, she said. We say that Rosalind has been like family to us for 40 years, that the photos show appropriate affection between close friends, nothing more. We weather the storm and protect what we can. Eleanor, no, Rosalind said sharply, moving to kneel beside the wheelchair so she could look directly into Eleanor's eyes. We are not going back to hiding. Not now, not when we finally have a chance to live honestly. Live honestly? Eleanor's voice rose the first time Vincent had heard her truly angry since this all began. Rosie, I'm dying. I have weeks, maybe days left. But you have to live in this world after I'm gone. Do you understand what this will mean for you? The stares, the whispers, the way people will look at you and see nothing but scandal. I don't care, Rosalind said fiercely. I have spent 35 years caring what other people think, and I am done. I am done pretending that loving you was something shameful instead of the greatest privilege of my life. Vincent watched this exchange with growing horror, realizing that the press attention wasn't just threatening their privacy, it was threatening to destroy them from within. The very love that had sustained them through decades of hiding was now being weaponized against itself. There has to be another way, he said desperately. I can buy the story, pay them not to run it. I can hire the best publicists, spin this somehow. Into what? Eleanor asked sadly. Vincent, there is no spin for this. Two women, one white and wealthy, one black and working class, loving each other for 35 years while maintaining the fiction that one worked for the other. There's no version of this story that society will accept gracefully. Then we make them accept it, Vincent said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. We tell the truth. All of it. We explain what love actually looks like when it's real, when it lasts, when it survives everything the world throws at it. Both women stared at him. Vincent, Eleanor said gently. You don't understand what you're saying. This won't just affect us. It will affect you, your business, your social connections. The Sterling name will be associated with scandal forever. Good, Vincent said, and realized he meant it completely. Maybe it's time the Sterling name was associated with something real for once instead of just money and appearances. He stood up, pacing the terrace, as his mind raced through possibilities. We hold a press conference. We invite them all here, to this house, to this garden where you've built a life together. We show them what 35 years of love looks like. We make them see you as human beings, instead of just scandal. And if they don't? Rosalind asked quietly. If they see exactly what Eleanor fears they'll see, two women who broke every rule society set for them. Vincent stopped pacing and looked at her. Really looked at her. This woman who had helped raise him, who had loved his mother with more devotion and consistency than most marriages ever achieved, who was facing the destruction of everything she held dear with quiet dignity. Then, at least we'll face it together, he said. As a family, as people who choose love over fear. Eleanor began to cry, not the gentle tears of nostalgia they'd shared over the past few weeks, but harsh, broken sobs that seemed to tear from the very center of her being. I'm so tired, she whispered. I'm so tired of being afraid, of hiding, of pretending that the most beautiful thing in my life was something to be ashamed of. Rosalind wrapped her arms around Eleanor's frail form, holding her with the same tenderness Vincent had witnessed that first morning in the breakfast room. But now he understood what he was seeing. Not just comfort, but a lifetime of comfort, decades of being each other's safe harbor in a world that had no place for them. We don't hide anymore, Rosalind said firmly, her own tears flowing freely. Whatever happens, we don't hide anymore. Vincent felt his phone buzzing insistently in his pocket. Probably Jessica, probably reporters, probably a dozen other people who would want to manage this crisis in ways that protected reputation over truth. But for the first time in his business career, he didn't care about managing anything. He cared about honoring the love he'd been blind to for 38 years. He cared about protecting the two women who had shown him what courage actually looked like. He cared about proving that some things, the most important things, were worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible to win. We face it together, he said again, sitting back down and taking each of their hands in his own. Whatever comes, we face it together. But even as he said the words, Vincent could see the fear in their eyes, could feel the weight of society's judgment pressing down on them like a physical force. In 6 hours, the world would know their secret, and despite all his money and influence and determination, he had no idea how to protect them from what was coming. The roses they had been tending seemed to mock them now, beautiful and fragile things that could be destroyed so easily by the wrong kind of attention. Just like love, just like family, just like everything that mattered most. Vincent sat alone in his father's study at 3 a.m., surrounded by the accumulated weight of 5 generations of sterling achievement. Awards lined the mahogany walls, photographs of handshakes with presidents and CEOs documented decades of influence and success. The portrait of his great-great-grandfather, the railroad baron who had built the family fortune, stared down at him with painted eyes that seemed to judge his worthiness to carry on the legacy. In 6 hours, that legacy would be redefined forever. His laptop glowed in the darkness, cursor blinking in an empty email compose window addressed to Jessica. One message could stop everything. A statement denying the allegations, distancing himself from any inappropriate relationship between his mother and their longtime housekeeper, painting Eleanor as a generous employer who had treated staff like family and Rosalind as a devoted employee whose loyalty had been misconstrued. It would be easy, clean. It would protect the sterling name, and preserve the carefully constructed image that had taken generations to build. All he had to do was sacrifice the two women who had taught him what love actually meant. His phone buzzed with another text from Jessica. "Sir, we need a decision. The story drops at 9 a.m. Legal says we can still get ahead of this if we move now." Vincent stared at the message until the screen went dark, reflecting back his haggard face in the black surface. When had he last slept? When had he last eaten? The past 18 hours had been a blur of phone calls from lawyers, publicists, and board members who had somehow already heard whispers of the impending scandal. "Distance yourself," they'd all advised. "This doesn't have to touch you directly if you handle it right." But how do you distance yourself from your own heart? Footsteps in the hallway made him look up. Rosalind appeared in the doorway, wearing a simple robe over her nightgown, her grey hair loose around her shoulders in a way he'd never seen before. Without the careful styling she maintained during the day, she looked older, more fragile, but also somehow more real. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. Vincent shook his head, gesturing to the chair across from his father's massive desk. "I keep thinking there has to be a solution I'm not seeing. Some way to protect you both without," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Without destroying everything you've worked for," Rosalind completed, settling into the leather chair with a soft sigh. "Vincent, you don't owe us anything. You didn't choose this situation." "Didn't I?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Didn't I choose this the moment I decided I wanted to be the kind of person who could love like you and Mother do? Didn't I choose this when I realized that 38 years of living for appearances had left me empty?" Rosalind studied his face in the dim light cast by the laptop screen. Vincent stood and walked to the window that looked out over the gardens where they'd worked together, where he'd finally begun to understand what family meant. The roses were invisible in the darkness, but he knew they were there, patient, enduring, waiting for dawn. "I'm saying that maybe some choices are bigger than the people making them," he said slowly, working through thoughts that had been forming all night. "Maybe some moments require you to decide who you really are, not who you've been pretending to be." "And who are you, Vincent Sterling?" Rosalind asked, her voice gentle but probing. He turned back to face her, this woman who had helped raise him while loving his mother in secret, who had sacrificed her own authenticity for decades to protect his comfort and social standing. "I'm the son of two women who taught me that real love is worth any risk," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I'm someone who spent 38 years confusing wealth with worth, success with significance. I'm someone who wants to learn how to be brave." Rosalind's eyes filled with tears. "Bravery isn't measured by what you're willing to sacrifice, Vincent. Sometimes it's measured by what you're willing to accept." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your mother is upstairs right now, probably staring at the ceiling, convinced that her love has destroyed her son's future. She's carrying guilt that should belong to a world that made us hide, not to two women who found something beautiful despite impossible odds." Vincent felt the truth of those words settle in his chest like a physical weight. "She thinks this is her fault." Of course, she does. Eleanor has spent her entire life taking responsibility for other people's comfort, other people's expectations. She's probably planning to deny everything tomorrow, to sacrifice her last chance at living openly just to protect your reputation. "I won't let her do that," Vincent said fiercely. "Then what will you do?" Rosalind asked, and something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Vincent looked at his laptop, at the empty email that could save his social standing and business empire at the cost of everything that had come to matter most. Then he closed it, decisively. "I'm going to tell the truth," he said. "All of it. I'm going to stand with you both and let the world know that the Sterling family finally learned what love looks like." Rosalind was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands clasped in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "You know what this will mean, don't you? The board might remove you. Investors might pull out. Your social circle will—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Some people will never look at you the same way again." "Good," Vincent said, echoing his words from the garden. Maybe it's time I learned the difference between people worth impressing and people worth loving. And if it all falls apart, if the business suffers, if you lose friends, if society decides you're as scandalous as we are. Vincent thought about this question, really considered what his life might look like on the other side of tomorrow's revelation. Smaller, probably. Less prestigious, certainly. But also more honest, more connected, more meaningful than anything he'd built before. Then we'll figure it out together, he said simply. As a family. Rosalind stood slowly, crossing to where Vincent stood by the window. For a moment she looked like she might hug him. The first time in 40 years she would have embraced him as an equal rather than as her employer's son. Instead, she placed one gentle hand on his cheek, the gesture more intimate and meaningful than any hug could have been. "Your mother is going to be so proud," she whispered, terrified but proud. "What about you?" Vincent asked. "Are you proud?" Rosalind smiled, and in that smile he saw decades of hidden joy, suppressed love, and quiet strength finally allowed to shine freely. "I'm proud of the man you've become," she said. "The man Eleanor and I always hoped you could be, even when we didn't dare believe it was possible." She turned to go, then paused in the doorway. "Vincent, tomorrow, when we face those reporters, when we tell our story, remember that love stories aren't always pretty, or convenient, or socially acceptable. But they're still love stories, and that makes them worth telling." After she left, Vincent sat back down at his father's desk and opened his laptop. But instead of composing an email to his assistant, he began writing something else entirely. A statement that would accompany tomorrow's press conference, words that would introduce the world to the real Sterling family story. He wrote about two women who had found love in impossible circumstances and had been brave enough to nurture it for 35 years. He wrote about his own blindness and awakening, about learning that true family wasn't defined by blood or law, but by the daily choice to love and support each other through everything life offered. He wrote about courage, not the kind that conquered mountains or built empires, but the quiet kind that chose authenticity over approval, truth over comfort, love over fear. As dawn began to creep through the study windows, Vincent Sterling finished writing the most important document of his life. Not a business proposal or merger agreement or legal contract, but a love letter to the family he'd finally learned to see. In 3 hours he would read these words to a room full of reporters and cameras, would watch the carefully constructed Sterling image crumble in real time, and for the first time in his adult life, he was completely at peace with that prospect. Because some things were worth more than reputation. Some loves were worth more than approval. Some families were worth fighting for, even when the fight felt impossible to win. What would you choose, protecting an image, or protecting love? Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stand up for the people who matter most, even when society tells us we shouldn't. What moments in your life required that kind of courage? Vincent printed his statement, then walked upstairs to find Eleanor and Rosalind waiting for him. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as the Sterling heir and his mother's staff, but as a family that had finally learned to choose love over everything else. The choice was made. Now all that remained was living with the consequences. The morning of the press conference dawned crisp and golden, October light streaming through the tall windows of the Sterling estate like a benediction. Vincent had arranged for the media to gather in the garden, not in some sterile conference room or corporate setting, but in the space where Eleanor and Rosalind had written their love story in soil and seasons for 35 years. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair beside the rose garden, wrapped in a cream-colored cashmere shawl that brought out the blue in her eyes. Despite her illness, she had insisted on full makeup and having her hair styled, not from vanity but from dignity. She would face the world as herself, completely and without apology. Rosalind stood beside her, one hand resting gently on Eleanor's shoulder, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that Eleanor had insisted on buying for her the day before. "If we're going public with our love story," Eleanor had said, "then you're going to look like the queen you've always been to me." Vincent watched from the terrace as reporters set up their equipment among the flower beds, their cameras and microphones an alien invasion in this sacred space. His hands were steady as he reviewed his statement one final time. though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. Second thoughts. Eleanor asked softly as he joined them in the garden. No, Vincent said, and was surprised by how much he meant it. No second thoughts. Only gratitude that I finally learned what courage looks like. He had expected to feel terrified in this moment, facing the destruction of everything he'd built his identity around. Instead, he felt something he'd never experienced before. The peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly the people who matter most. Jessica approached with final logistics. 37 media outlets had shown up, including major networks and international press. The story had already begun circulating online, with leaked photos and speculation running wild across social media. "Sir, we're ready when you are," Jessica said, her voice carefully neutral. She had worked for Vincent for 8 years, and had never seen him look so calm before a high-stakes presentation. Vincent nodded, then knelt beside Eleanor's wheelchair. "Are you ready for this, Mother?" Eleanor's eyes sparkled with something Vincent had never seen there before. Not just love, but freedom. The freedom that comes from finally being able to live without secrets. "I've been ready for 35 years, she said simply. Vincent stood, took his place behind the small podium that had been set up between 2 rose bushes, and looked out at the sea of cameras and expectant faces. For a moment he thought about his father, about all the sterling ancestors whose portraits lined the house, about the weight of family legacy and social expectation. Then he thought about love, real love, patient love, the kind that grows quietly in gardens and whispers truth in midnight conversations. And he began to speak. "Good morning. Thank you all for coming to our family home. I know you're here because of rumors and speculation about my mother, Eleanor Sterling, and Rosalind Washington, who has been part of our family for 40 years. Rather than let others tell our story, we've decided to tell it ourselves." He paused, meeting the eyes of several reporters, letting the weight of what he was about to say settle in the morning air. 35 years ago, 2 women found love in circumstances that society told them made that love impossible. One was a wealthy white widow struggling to find meaning in a life built on appearances. The other was a young black woman who had lost everything and came to our household looking for nothing more than honest work and a safe place to heal. Vincent glanced back at Eleanor and Rosalind, drawing strength from their presence. What they found instead was something rare and precious, a connection that transcended every boundary society had built between them. They found partnership, devotion, and a love so genuine that it sustained them through decades of necessary secrecy. A murmur ran through the assembled press. This wasn't the denial they had expected, nor was it the salacious confession they had hoped for. This was something else entirely. A love story told with dignity and pride. For 35 years, my mother, Eleanor Sterling, and Rosalind Washington have loved each other with a depth and consistency that most marriages never achieve. They have been partners in every sense of the word, caring for this home, raising me, building a life together that was hidden from the world but never hidden from their hearts. Vincent's voice grew stronger, more confident as he continued. They hid their relationship not because they were ashamed of it, but because they understood the price of living authentically in a world that wasn't ready for their love. They chose each other's safety over their own freedom, each other's well-being over their own desires to live openly. That's not scandal, that's sacrifice. That's the kind of love that makes people better, that makes families stronger, that makes the world more beautiful. He could see tears in several reporters' eyes now, could feel the atmosphere in the garden shifting from predatory anticipation to genuine attention. I stand here today as a man who spent 38 years of his life blind to the greatest love story happening right in front of him. I was so focused on business and social expectations that I never bothered to really see these 2 extraordinary women who were teaching me every day what devotion actually looks like. Vincent turned to face Eleanor and Rosalind directly, speaking to them as much as to the cameras. "My mother is dying, her heart is failing, and we have very little time left together. But instead of spending her final weeks in hiding, instead of continuing to pretend that the most important relationship of her life was something to be ashamed of, she has chosen to live her last days in truth." Eleanor smiled through her tears, her hand finding Rosalind's and squeezing tight. "Rosalind Washington is not our housekeeper," Vincent continued, his voice ringing with conviction. "She is my mother's partner, my second mother, and the strongest woman I have ever known. She is family in every way that matters, and it is time the world knew that." He faced the cameras again, his father's son in his bearing, but his mother's son in his heart. "I know this story doesn't fit neat categories. I know it challenges assumptions about class and race and what love is supposed to look like, but the most beautiful things usually do challenge our assumptions. The most meaningful relationships usually do transcend the boundaries we think are important." Vincent picked up the statement he had written, though he found he barely needed to refer to it now. The words were coming from somewhere deeper than preparation, from a place of truth he'd never accessed before. The Sterling family has built its reputation on business success and social standing. Today we choose to build it on something more important, on the courage to love authentically, to live honestly, and to show the world that families come in many forms, all of them worthy of respect and celebration. He paused, looking out at the garden where Eleanor and Rosalind had nurtured both flowers and love for decades. "My mother and Rosalind will be married next week in this garden, surrounded by the roses they planted together and the family they created together. It will be a small ceremony, because Eleanor's health is fragile, but it will be legal, public, and joyful. After 35 years of loving in secret, they deserve to be celebrated." The announcement sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled media. Marriage, not just an admission of a relationship, but a public celebration of it. "I want to be clear about something," Vincent continued. "This is not a publicity stunt or damage control. This is two women in their 70s finally getting to have the wedding they should have had decades ago. This is love winning, after years of fear and hiding and compromise." He looked directly into the main camera, speaking to viewers he would never meet, but whose opinions would shape how this story was received. "I know some of you will judge us. I know some of you will see this as scandal rather than love story. But I hope some of you will see what I finally learned to see, that real love is rare and precious, that it deserves protection and celebration regardless of the forms it takes." Vincent stepped back from the podium and walked to where Eleanor and Rosalind sat. He knelt between them, taking both their hands in his. "I love you both," he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch, but speaking only to them. "I'm proud to be your son, proud to be part of this family, proud to finally understand what love at last actually means." Eleanor was crying openly now, tears of joy and relief and gratitude streaming down her cheeks. Rosalind's composure finally cracked, and she pulled Vincent into a fierce embrace. The first time in 40 years she had hugged him as family rather than as staff. The questions came fast and intense after that, about the business implications, about the timeline of the relationship, about the legal and social challenges they had faced. But Vincent answered them all with the same steady honesty, never defensive, never apologetic, always returning to the central truth. This was a love story, and love stories deserved celebration, not condemnation. 3 weeks later. The wedding was everything Eleanor had dreamed of, and nothing like society weddings were supposed to be. 25 people gathered in the rose garden on a perfect November afternoon, the late season blooms providing a backdrop of soft colors and gentle fragrance. Eleanor, too weak to stand for the entire ceremony, sat in her wheelchair wearing a simple cream silk dress and the pearl necklace her grandmother had worn at her own wedding. Rosalind stood beside her in deep purple velvet, radiant with happiness that no longer had to be hidden. Vincent walked them both down the makeshift aisle, giving away two mothers to each other in a ceremony that felt both intimate and historic. The officiant was a progressive minister who had driven 3 hours to perform a service she called a celebration of love that has already proven its strength through decades of devotion. The vows they exchanged were simple and private. Words meant for each other rather than for the small audience of friends who had chosen to support them despite social pressure to distance themselves. Some old friends had indeed disappeared, their discomfort with the revelation proving stronger than decades of supposed affection. But the people who remained, the ones who understood that love in all its forms was worth celebrating, created a circle of support that felt both sacred and joyful. Dr. Morrison was there, having become something of a family friend as Eleanor's condition continued to decline. Jessica attended with her wife, having surprised Vincent by asking if she could bring her own hidden love into the light. 3 of Vincent's business associates came, men who had initially expressed concerns about the optics, but who found themselves moved by witnessing such authentic devotion. Most surprisingly, Eleanor's estranged sister Margaret had flown in from California, bringing with her 40 years of regret for choosing social acceptability over family loyalty. The reunion between the sisters was tearful and healing, another relationship salvaged by the power of choosing truth over fear. As the ceremony concluded with the traditional kiss, Eleanor and Rosalind's first public display of affection in 35 years, Vincent felt something shift inside his chest. Not just happiness for them, but a deep understanding of what he wanted for his own life. Real love. Patient love. The kind that chose to grow quietly and persistently until it became strong enough to withstand any storm. 6 weeks later, Eleanor passed peacefully on a Tuesday morning in December, with Rosalind holding her hand and Vincent reading aloud from the poetry collection they had discovered among Rosalind's hidden treasures. Her last words were, "Thank you for teaching me how to be brave," though it was never entirely clear whether she was speaking to Rosalind, or to Vincent, or to life itself. The funeral was held in the garden she had loved, among the roses that would bloom again in spring, carrying forward the beauty she and Rosalind had created together. The service was attended by hundreds of people, not just society figures fulfilling obligations, but genuine mourners who had been touched by the courage Eleanor had shown in her final weeks. The media coverage was respectful, even admiring. The initial scandal had transformed into something else entirely. A story about the power of authentic love to change hearts and minds, about the difference between reputation and character, about the courage required to live honestly in a world that often rewards pretense. Rosalind inherited half the estate, as Eleanor had always intended but had only recently been able to make legal. The other half went to Vincent, along with a letter that began, "Thank you for becoming the man I always knew you could be, for loving us enough to be brave, for showing me that family is not about blood or law, but about the daily choice to care for each other's hearts." Vincent read that letter in his father's study, surrounded by the same portraits and awards that had once defined his sense of worth. But now they seemed like artifacts from someone else's life, symbols of achievements that had mattered far less than he'd ever imagined. 1 year later, Vincent found Rosalind in the garden on a crisp October morning, tending the roses that had just finished their second bloom since Eleanor's death. At 76, she moved more slowly than before, but her hands were still sure and gentle as she worked among the flowers that held so many memories. "How are they looking?" he asked, settling onto the bench that had become his favorite spot for their morning conversations. "Ready for winter," Rosalind said, brushing soil from her gloves. "But strong. They'll come back even more beautiful in the spring." Vincent had learned to read the metaphors in Rosalind's gardening observations. She was talking about more than flowers. "I have something to tell you," he said, and Rosalind looked up with the alert attention she'd always given to his important announcements. Though their relationship had evolved far beyond employer and employee, she still cared deeply about his well-being and happiness. "I met someone," he continued, and watched Rosalind's face light up with genuine joy. "Oh, Vincent, tell me everything." Her name was Carmen, and she was a pediatric nurse who had never heard of Sterling Industries when they met at a coffee shop near the children's hospital where she worked. She was funny and kind and completely unimpressed by his wealth, more interested in his volunteer work at the literacy center he'd started in Eleanor's memory. "She doesn't care that I'm rich?" Rosalind asked, teasingly. "She cares that I'm kind," Vincent replied. "She cares that I'm honest about my feelings, that I'm willing to be vulnerable, that I understand the difference between loving someone and trying to possess them." They had talked for hours on their first date about family and loss and the different forms love could take. Carmen had listened to the story of Eleanor and Rosalind with tears in her eyes, saying afterward, "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You're so lucky to have learned about love from women like that." "When do I get to meet her?" Rosalind asked. Actually, Vincent said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket, I was hoping you'd help me with something first. Rosalind's hands flew to her mouth as she recognized what he was showing her. The engagement ring that had belonged to his great-grandmother, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations of sterling marriages. You want to marry her, Rosalind said, wonder in her voice. I want to love her the way you loved Mother, Vincent corrected, with patience and devotion and the kind of courage that chooses truth over comfort. I want to build something real with her, something that could last 35 years and still be growing stronger. Rosalind stood and walked to him, taking his hands in hers with the same tenderness she'd shown him as a child, but now with the added warmth of someone who saw him as family in every sense of the word. Your mother would be so proud, she said softly. Not just because you found love, but because you found the right kind of love, the kind that makes you better instead of smaller. Vincent looked around the garden where his real education about love had taken place, where he'd learned that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or achieved, but only cultivated with patience and care. Will you walk me down the aisle? He asked. When Carmen and I get married, will you be the mother who gives me away to the woman I love? Rosalind's tears were immediate and joyful. Oh, sweetheart, nothing would make me prouder. As they sat together in the garden, planning a wedding that would celebrate love without secrets or shame, Vincent realized that Eleanor had been right about one thing. Love stories don't end with death. They continue in the lives they change, in the courage they inspire, in the families they create. What does love at last mean to you? Sometimes it takes a lifetime to learn how to love authentically, how to choose connection over convention. What love story in your life taught you the most about what really matters? Share your thoughts below, because every real love story deserves to be celebrated. 6 months later, Vincent married Carmen in the same garden where Eleanor and Rosalind had finally claimed their love publicly. Rosalind walked him down the aisle, radiant in pale blue silk, officially recognized as what she had always been, family. The ceremony was attended by people who had chosen love over judgment, authenticity over appearances, truth over comfort. As Vincent and Carmen exchanged vows among the roses that Eleanor and Rosalind had planted together, as they promised to love each other with patience and courage and honesty, the October light seemed to dance on every petal, every leaf, every face turned toward hope. Love at last wasn't just about timing, Vincent realized. It was about readiness. It was about finally understanding that real love, the kind that lasts, the kind that matters, requires you to be brave enough to be completely yourself with another person. It had taken him 39 years, and the courage of 2 remarkable women to learn that lesson. But some education is worth waiting for, and some love stories are worth every moment it takes to finally get them right. In the garden where secrets had finally become celebrations, where hidden love had bloomed into public joy, the Sterling family had learned what it really meant to choose each other, not just once but every day with patience and courage and hope. And the roses, tended by love and time, continued to bloom.
The end. Vincent has grown from an emotionally distant billionaire to someone who understands authentic love. Eleanor and Rosalind got their public wedding in recognition, and the story ends with Vincent finding his own authentic love, guided by the lessons his mothers taught him about courage and devotion. If this story touched your heart, the next one will absolutely captivate you. It's filled with even more unexpected twists and deeper emotions than you can imagine. Don't miss it. Click on the image on your screen right now to watch the next story. Thank you for joining me on this journey of love and courage.